Welcome to the 44th episode of the Interview Series. The Interview Series is a production of 1 Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. And please like and subscribe to help us continue producing valuable content. I'm Matthew Schmidt, joined today by Jill Stukenberg. Jill Stukenberg's novel, News of the Air, previously titled Labor Day, was selected as the 2021 winner of the Big Moose Prize from Black Lawrence Press and will be published in fall 2022. Her short stories have appeared in Midwestern Gothic, The Collegist, now The Rupture, The Florida Review, and other literary magazines. An associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, she has published in the area of creative writing pedagogy and has over 20 years of experience as a writing teacher. Welcome, Jill.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me.
Of course, we're glad you're here. So today, we'll be looking at an excerpt from the first chapter of News of the Air. Got my copy here.
That's so cool. I hadn't seen a printed galley yet. So.
Oh, you haven't? Yeah, no. Here it is.
Yeah.
So to start off with, I thought I'd just ask a basic overall kind of question. Since you've published short stories and creative writing pedagogy, and your first novel is about to come out, what are some of the significant things that you've learned on your journey as both a writer and a teacher?
Thanks for the question. And it really has been a journey. I've been reflecting that I finished an MFA degree 18 years ago, and this is my first published book. And I've been joking that if someone would have told me that when I was 22, I just would have thought, well, hang it all up, right? Like, no way, right? But I'm glad I stuck around for the really long ride and the long journey. And I think in my case in particular, I think there's reasons that I wasn't ready to publish until now, or that my work wasn't ready. And I've been glad. I think that one thing that I've learned about writing is one of the same things that I've learned about teaching, which is just to trust more. In the case with students, it's to trust more that they will learn. If I can set up a interesting problem or an interesting activity, and then I have to step out of the way and let them do it, and try not to do it for them. And trust that even if it's challenging, they can do it, and it's a little bit true with my writing. I have to trust that if I work a little bit over a long period of time, but keep it up, that it will all accrue to something, and trust that if I am sitting, forcing something to come one day, it might be okay. Maybe it's okay sometimes to write badly. It's okay a lot of the time to write badly, but it's also okay to take a break and say, nope, coming back to this tomorrow. I'm going to just trust like the long-term process that it will yield something in the end.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've tried kind of multiple ways myself, where I'll write every day for a while, and then I won't write hardly at all for quite a long time, and a few things here and there. But it seems to be like whatever works for the writer seems to be what the best advice is, I guess, to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, so again, to trust that, it's also a long life. It's a long life of writing. If we're lucky, and that one thing that works for you at one age doesn't have to work for you again, even in different seasons. I'm a teacher, so I'm tied to the academic schedule. And one way of writing works for me in the summer when I'm fortunate enough to have time off. That doesn't work for me during the academic year. And I think, so that's also something I've had to learn to trust is, yeah, it's okay if during the academic year, I'm not writing every day, but it's okay, and in fact, I like to embrace that as part of the process too. Those pages that I tuck away that I worked on really hard over the summer. And if I don't get a chance to really read them again, until some day later in the semester where, miraculously, I don't have a committee meeting or something, I can read them. It was good that I had that time not looking at it. That was part of the process too. That was the time it had to bake or it had to sit. And so I could look at it again with fresh eyes. And so again, it's okay to have times where you don't write, so that when you come back to it, you still can,
Oh yeah. Well, let's look at some of your writing. First, maybe you could Summarize briefly what News of the Air is about.
Sure, thanks. So in the prologue, my two main characters, a husband and wife character, leave Chicago after a rash of ecoterrorism, and they move to northern Wisconsin, to a place that we call the Northwoods. I live in Wisconsin also, and it's kind of it's an indeterminate top half of Wisconsin, but it also includes the upper peninsula of Michigan. And then they move there in order to just start running a small family fishing resort. The rest of the novel picks up 18 years later, when they also have an 18-year-old daughter now who's kind of coming of age. And a number of things have happened that have put her in trouble. She's homeschooled, but she's involved in an orchestra, and a girl in the orchestra died a year before. And there's some circumstances where people suspect she was bullied by the other girls. There's the environment, the tourism economy around the main characters are deteriorating. And people are starting to talk about climate change or about other things like floods and fires and a bad economy that seems to be happening. And then two strange children show up at the resort alone and by canoe. And they kind of match reports of other people that have been seen in the woods more and more often, people kind of coming and going, and people wonder if they're camping or if they're actually living in the woods. And so basically, 18 years later, the two main characters have to start to wonder if the problems of the city have actually found them here. And but then also the two main characters who are married to each other have increasingly different views of what is happening. They interpret that reality in two different ways, and it's not good for their marriage.
Well said, well said.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt from the early draft. Let's see here. I'll pull it up on the screen for our readers.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so this is an early draft. You're right. I'm not sure if it's not the very first draft, but it's some middle-ish kind of draft. And I think this part that you've asked me to read is just the first 2 pages. So right. Here it goes. Pencil, scissors, can opener. At first, the children's cries were only vaguely alarming. Allie heard the shrieks from inside pines, where the late summer breeze ferried their voices, isolated and individual, like lost birds or straggling summer tourists. The old cabin's wooden floor was strewn with the detritus of the project she'd begun at the start of the summer. From the doorway, she surveyed the wreckage, more like a flood had washed through than a remodel were underway. A pulled cabinet perched atop the debris like a glacial sheaf ready to slide. Allie bent to extract one wooden handle from the wreckage. Could this be the good hammer, subject these last months of a near manhunt in her household? Jackknife, screwdriver. Another gust brought the children's voices as if offering guesses. But the tool that emerged was a thing she'd never seen before. Its heavy meat tenderizer-like base conjured the distant past and the tasks that had vanished with it, like churning, ironing, applying sunscreen to children topically rather than spraying it on with aerosol. Allie hadn't been expecting a family with children, though multiple arrivals had been slated for this Friday afternoon of Labor Day weekend, end of a summer nearing another end of a year, with numbers on it like from a sci-fi novel. Who would have thought that in the future she'd live this way, more simply than she had decades ago? Allie spent her days mowing the lawn and wiping spiders from canoes with rags salvaged from t-shirts. In winter, snowed in, her small family might go a week without seeing other humans, only their tracks and the bunnies leading down to the frozen lake. There were so many bunnies and deer. At the next cry from the direction of the beach, Allie rose from the rubble of her project, tapping the new tool against her palm. Her feet knew each toe-stubbing route of the zigging path that wound between the cabins on their side of Little Eagle Lake, the width of which through the unchecked undergrowth matched that of their radio flyer, bringer of plastic-wrapped linens and taker of plastic-bagged trash. The breeze carried smell too, piney woods and lake algae, stewed by the swirling lassitude of midday, late summer heat. She only frowned a little, noting a place last spring's rains had started to nibble at the path's edge, eroding the small dune. Pine's cabin, as well as the cabin her family had made their home, Maples, was slowly sinking into the resort's sandy soil. Only thin strands of swaying grasses, and the rash of spike rush that Allie was encouraging held everything. The one small clearing of their lawn with its swing set, horseshoe pits, bonfire circle, from ruin. Or most things from ruin. Reaching Maple's water-facing lawn, Allie understood what had been nagging her in the children's cries. They weren't followed by splashes. Corkscrew, the girl called, twisting as she dropped, not into the water, glittering in the near distance with the inviting sheen of a Leinenkugel's commercial, but from the top bar of the swing set into the grass. You supervising this? Allie turned to her 18-year-old daughter. In Allie's hand, the short spikes at the end of the strange tool she'd pulled from Pine's cabin took on resemblance to a teenager's lip stud. Not well, Cassie answered. Who are they? Allie asked next.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks.
So initially, this first chapter appeared, or parts of this first chapter, appeared in a short story that was published in Midwestern Gothic. I'm curious, what made you decide that this was novel material, and how did you go about working towards that?
Right. I was so thrilled when Midwestern Gothic published the short story version of this, and then a friend of mine who was a great reader. Her name's Heather Herman. She has a recent book out too. That's a feminist young adult horror novel called The Corpse Queen. She read the short story and she was like, Jill, this is a novel, and I was like, oh yes, I would like to do it as a novel. And I mean, by saying that, she didn't mean that it didn't have a plot or something by itself as a short story, but just that it seemed like that there were a lot of mysteries that were still lurking in even just that short story. Like there were different strands, different rabbit trails, different characters that could have opened up into other things. And I just wanted to do it because I had so much fun living in this world of this like rundown fishing resort in the Northwoods. And I thought, yeah, I just want to stay here, and write more because it was a fun setting to inhabit. And I had grown to like the characters. So yeah, then I did start to imagine what the other threads were that would lead off from that first chapter and what the backstory was, what had happened even before the flashpoint of the story.
Yeah, so initially you did send at least part of this or a draft of this to an agent. And they suggested you cut down on exposition in the early draft. And you mentioned to me that you also worked on dramatizing tension between characters in the revision. How do you teach students to create tension? And did you use similar strategies in your revision process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I think that tension is something that I always need to revise for and maybe that's true for lots of writers, because when you write a first draft, you're just following the ride of the sentences, maybe, or maybe you're just writing to see what will happen. And the hard part is always, and no matter, I think this is hard no matter how long you've been writing. The hard part is then looking at those pages and trying to imagine it as if you're somebody who never read them before. And what does it look like to somebody? What does it look like to a reader? What's interesting or what's not? What's confusing? How do you take this thing that was your daydream and make it accessible to somebody else? And so that's always what that part of revision is about. And I think that thinking about tension is what helps me to do that. In part, I always write too much. So my process is one of cutting out. And I have to do that by imagining, what does a reader not need to know? What can they know later? What's just excess description? And also, so I use a textbook. You asked about working with students, and I have it right here because I love this book. I teach Intro to Creative Writing at an open access 2-year branch campus of a state school. And this is called The Practice of Creative Writing. And the author is Heather Sellers. Now that I'm holding this up, it's probably going to look backwards on the camera, but her name is Heather Sellers. And this is a great book. And of course, there are other excellent creative writing books and textbooks, but she has a chapter where she discusses tension across genres. And in particular, she talks about thinking about tension as having characters who have obstacles that they have to meet, but then also the idea that you need to have something at stake. And so that's another dimension too, is sometimes you have a character and an obstacle, but you realize you have to make it clear to the reader, why does it matter? Why does it matter to this character if that obstacle can't be surmounted? So she uses that language to kind of break apart stories. And then she has a couple of example stories, including this one that's called What I Saw from Where I Stood by Marissa Silver, which is a short story that's included in the textbook. And she, the author of the textbook, Heather Sellers, goes through and even shows how you can think about tension as happening from sentence to sentence. Is this a sentence that has rising tension? And is the very next sentence adjusting that attention in some way? Is it turning it up or turning it down? Because actually you have to turn down the tension sometimes so that you can turn it up again later. But she really helped me as a teacher. You know, here I was using this textbook to teach my students, but it helped me to think about tension as being something that can operate at the sentence level, and that you can be dialing up or turning down from one sentence to the next sentence. And sometimes it's something that's something dramatic, but also sometimes just a description is a tense description, or it's a description that's a deflating, you know, description. So I use this book, and I use that concept of tension to think about what to cut. There's a couple of other tricks that I've learned with my particular burden of I need to write, I need to cut because I've always written too much. One thing I've learned to do is I do type when I write. I know some people write longhand, but I type on the computer. I will change how the words on the page look to my eye. That also helps a little bit with that trick that I talked about earlier of where you have to see the words as if they're new to you in order to revise or edit. And so sometimes I kick in the margins, you know, by like 2 or 3 inches, so it appears like a newspaper column. And when you do that, all the words you wrote they break differently, first of all, on the lines, but also then it helps when you're editing to write shorter paragraphs. One thing I notice is that, of course, the difference between my earlier drafts and my later drafts is my paragraphs also get shorter, which I think is good for tension and for keeping the reader's attention and for moving a story along. I also might change the font size or change the font, or these are like tricks, like I'm tricking myself into pretending as if I haven't read it before or as if I'm seeing it in some new way. But those things do help me a lot on the page. So I do sometimes advise that to writers, actually, even in composition classes, when people are editing, you know, an essay, I sometimes suggest a great way to find typos is just to change the margins and read it through once with the words will fall in different places. You'll see it with fresh eyes. And then, you know, then kick those margins back out before you turn it in, right? Right.
Yeah, so I really like that idea of following, you know, the idea of following a sentence and then writing the next sentence as part of the composition, and then going back and seeing what you can heighten for tension or revise, you know, and lower the tension. I was just thinking about this while you were talking about that, but what do you say to writers who maybe their difficulty is not writing too much, but the hard part for them is they want the sentence to be perfect before they move on, or
Right.
they're maybe like a little less certain where things are going to go, and so they're worried like, well, how do I get past this? How do I, you know, do I just jump into the obstacle now of the character and, you know, deal with it, or do I come back later and do that?
Yeah, that feeling when you're writing a first draft, and it happens a lot maybe with newer writers, but also it still happens with me when I'm writing a new story. I mean, of course, every time I start a new story or a new chapter, I hope this is going to be the one that's just perfect the first time, right? Like I'm like, maybe I'll just get lucky. I'll just never tell anyone about it that this was a first draft. And I mean, that's never happened to me in 20 years. And I don't know of other writers who usually admit to that, right? But you always hope that it'll be right the first time. It's hard to sort of allow yourself to, because you have to care enough to keep writing. So you can't just be like, this is all crap, I'm going to revise it later, right? You do have to care enough to keep going. I think, so one thing that I do with writers in my class is we'll write together during class. Sometimes there's just the pressure of everyone in the room is writing that helps you to keep going instead of stopping and saying, oh, it's terrible, I'll just take a break and stop doing it. Or I also find that it helps we do collaborative writing with partners, where so one writer, especially I like to do this as a dialogue, where one writer writes one line of dialogue and another writer, it plays another character and answers. And actually what's helpful about this is that you, the writer, don't have control over what's happening in the story. You have no control because the other person is changing it. Every time you write a line, they're changing it. And so it's kind of an exercise for people who are holding on too much to the plot or holding on too much to trying to be in control of everything that happens. It forces you to write a draft where you're like, I wasn't in control. And I actually think that then it's easier for then the second thing is that then I have the students break up as a partner, as a team, and then individually revise the piece into their own piece. And they're allowed to cut anything. And then they have the experience of, they can cut stuff their partner wrote, which is fun if they didn't like what their partner wrote. Although some of them love what their partner wrote and they keep that. But it's easier to cut because it feels less precious to them, and I think that it takes off some of this like that perfectionism that we can fall victim to ourselves. So those are two like classroom exercises that I might do to help students, write a draft that's a little bit messy, let go a little bit to write that messy draft.
Yeah, definitely. I think what I'm hearing is it changes their perspective. And a lot of the tools that you use for yourself and some for your students as well changes the perspective so that you can see the story in the new way. So let's talk about perspective in this particular novel, News of the Air.
Yeah.
At different times, all three family members, Allie, Cassie, and Bud, are leading the story, right? The perspective is from their point of view. And we learn new facts and ideas from the characters that coalesce into a truth. And I think perhaps it's a truth that I, as the reader, get to kind of put together myself instead of being kind of told exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted that choice of employing multiple perspectives? And how did you manage ordering them?
So first of all, I love and I am just flattered by your reading that you because I was hoping that was there. That's one of those things where I'm like, I hope that there are three different points of view in the novel. The couple and then their daughter has a point of view too, and the different sections, and it often rotates by chapters. But like you said, I was hoping for this effect in the final draft where you realize that's not exactly the way, the same incident is described in different ways by different characters. And it leaves the reader thinking, well, what's the truth then? And sometimes there's things I tried to make so the reader could piece them together. But anyway, so thank you for that. Thank you for that careful reading. That makes me thrilled that it came across like that way. I think, so what prompted that? So a couple things. I guess I can go back to just thinking about tension. One way to increase tension is to switch point of view, to have, you change the tension, or it's a way to decrease tension too, right? It's if something was boiling to a head but you want to prolong the story, you can white space, break, make the reader wait and go to some other character. What are they doing meanwhile, right? That's a way you can prolong tension. Of course, I've heard it described as that can also be a bad thing for a writer to do too much, right? If you're using it as just like a way to, to avoid telling the story, changing the point of view is not great. But I knew that partially I was doing it in places for attention, like switch point of view now, right? To somebody else, make the reader wait to find out what was just happening. But another reason I wrote it that way, and I've written some other stories with multiple points of view, is because it really just seems true to me in families that, people in a family are oftentimes living the same experience, living in the same house or on the same vacation, but they have a different story when they tell people about what it was like. That just seems true to me. And it's actually something that really fascinates me about people and about, communities in life, is that we can have been at the same party and afterwards we tell it in two different ways. And what is true then, right? What was the event seen through one person's point of view and someone else's? And I love that. I love it when I read it in novels or when I see it in movies, where, although I do feel like it's something actually that novels can do a little bit better than movies, is because you have this, you can, especially if you're doing third person, right? And you're filtering through someone's point of view, that's something we can do even better, And I think finally also what I was thinking about, I was writing this book. It took me I definitely wrote this book over a period of at least 6 years, if not 8 years, also with the revising. And then the time it took me to find a place to publish it was also a couple years. I was writing it during some years in Wisconsin, where politically we were very divided. We went through, and now I think we all feel like the whole country is divided politically, but I'm going to tell you, it was happening in Wisconsin even earlier, right? Like we had some particular, and it was not just politics, but it was also demographics. Like I've grown up in Wisconsin. I've lived here most of my life, and there's a divide among people who live in rural areas and people who live in urban areas. And there's a feeling on both parts, like that they're not understood, right? And I think so. I was also really influenced by this political discourse and by life in Wisconsin at the time, where it felt like that politics were really dividing people, and also like that people were just looking at the world and emerging with two different pictures of reality, and I think this is what we all see now, where we say, whoa, are we reading the same newspapers? And we're not. I mean, that's part of it, right? But it also feels like, are we living the same world? Like, how do you see this one situation? You see it this way. I totally see it this way. And so because of the ways that also my book did start to take on some themes of politics, because it also was concerned with climate change, I was also then interested in this idea of different points of view.
Yeah, one thing that made me think of is in families, even in families, there seems to be a hierarchy of, well, parents, children, certainly, grandparents, grandchildren, right? But even within, say, the parents level or the children level, there are different things pulling at different people. And because of that, and the interests of the people or characters, right, they view things through different lenses. And so it is, right, it's like that impossible thing. It's like, what is the truth, And it makes me think of like court dramas or something where like no eyewitness is really credible insofar as most of it's based on memory and not, the actual event, which makes it really difficult.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting comparison, right? Like how reliable are any of us, and if we filter all knowledge through what we know, and that's based on our experiences. And so that means it's all relative, how we see it.
Definitely. So time can enact great change on people and characters. And Allie Crane, the mother, and her family have spent 18 years in the woods. And I can't help but think of fairy tales. Though here, there aren't really good and evil characters, in my mind at least, but more ordinary people. Instead, I think it's the landscape that offers magical qualities, and the fact that these qualities aren't able to be strictly controlled or regulated, such as happens in major cities and countries. How do you write landscape as an entity or a character?
That's a great question too, and I love that you saw the landscape as being so central to this novel, because that was what I was taken with. So I live in Wausau, which is in central Wisconsin, and I grew up in north of Green Bay, but more north of where I am right now is what's more often considered the Northwoods of Wisconsin, and so this territory of my novel, and it really is a wild place in some ways. There's a lot of large national forests, just huge tracts of land that are beautiful and old. And there's, of course, there are people who live there, right? But there are also not that many people who live there, and there's something dense about them. They're a difficult place to live, like especially in winter. It's a deadly place to live if you're not prepared, or if you don't have a vehicle. You could get stuck, you could get snowed in the woods easily, lost in a lot of places. And so that place really took hold of my imagination because of that wild quality of it. And I visited there with my family. My family and I went to on a vacation to a small fishing resort when I had a newborn baby. I had a little 3-month-old baby with me. And I mean, it was an easy place to be. We stayed in a cabin, but that was when I was there. That was when I started thinking about, whoa, what would it be like if I really lived here, and if I had a baby, and if there weren't this many people, if it was a smaller resort even, so that really took my imagination. But so that landscape, the Northwoods, to think of how do you write a landscape as a character, I think it's like thinking about what power that landscape has and how it influences the people's lives. And the book is now a book that I think some people could read and consider to be a work of eco-fiction, or even a work of climate fiction, which is sometimes called cli-fi. I didn't necessarily start out trying to write a book that would be labeled eco-fiction or cli-fi, although over the years of writing it, I did become aware of those terms and start to think about, yeah, this is kind of what I'm doing. But one of the basic definitions of eco-fiction is that it's a book where the landscape, the environment is a character. Like, it is a force in the characters' lives. There's something about the land, the energy, the weather of that place that is influencing the plot, not just the people. But I think that you could write, I think it's hard to, where could you live though that the landscape or the setting is not influencing you either? Now I'm kind of taken by that other question, even if it was in the middle of a city, which may in some ways be more controlled and regulated. Well, then that's a landscape that's influencing you too. What does it mean to live in a controlled and regulated place? So I guess it's kind of thinking just about, if we want to write about people, and if we're writing realist fiction or fiction that to some degree is realist, we have to think about everything that influences us, everything that exerts a force on us. And of course, where we are, our setting or our landscape is one of those things that's influencing how we understand the world, what we see. And it's fun to write about the creepy woods and make it sort of like its own entity.
Yeah, and I think one thing about the setting is the water. Like, the water is a major factor in this story. And one of the things I'm thinking about when I say, like, you can't control it, is that there's so much water on planet Earth that you really can't harness it. You can't actually, like, demarcate where one country begins and the next country ends, let alone states. And so I find that fascinating as, like, it's a barrier, but it's also a way to move through the world. And I really like how that comes into play, along with obviously the woods, which are not easy to move through at all times. And I think the characters, like the decisions the characters make in this book, are influenced by those particular landscapes in a really nice way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I like that reading too. Right, my character, they kind of live on a chain of lakes that are interconnected, especially, and that changes in different seasons when the water's high or when the water's low, and it's affected by drought or affected by flood, which is happening, where they live from time to time. So whether or not they can navigate those water passages or not. This is true in the Northwoods, and it's true in my novel that those rivers and those lakes cross borders. They don't, the political borders are just lines humans have made, and sometimes they follow a river or a body of water, but not always. In the Northwoods, that's a great place where, sure, you can canoe from Wisconsin to Upper Michigan, back and forth, multiple different lakes or chains. There wouldn't be a sign, you wouldn't know, but those waterways cross borders. And of course, borders are also a part of my novel in the sort of semi-future-ish, now-ish world that my novel occupies. There are some things happening with the northern border. There's more strict control over who is moving between states, but also then, of course, moving between the United States and Canada, which in my novel, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is in between Wisconsin and Lake Superior, but the Upper Peninsula of Michigan isn't that wide. And so Lake Superior is then the next giant body of water that is between the United States and Canada, and so an international border. And that is also part of the story too in my novel, is people crossing that border and using waterways to cross the border. And because of kind of some of those reasons you said, right? Like, water isn't a border, or it can't be contained.
Definitely, yeah. So now I'd like to take a look at the revised or novel version of this first part of the first chapter.
Okay.
And I will pull it up here. And whenever you are ready.
Sure. So listeners will notice how much shorter this is than the 2 pages I read earlier. Although some sentences are the same. Pencil, scissors, can opener. At first, the children's cries were only vaguely alarming. Allie heard the shrieks from inside pines where the late summer breeze varied their voices, isolated and individual, like lost birds or straggling summer tourists. The old cabin's wooden floor was strewn with the detritus of the project she'd begun at the start of the summer. More like a flood had washed through than a remodel was underway. A pulled cabinet perched atop the debris like a glacial sheaf ready to slide. Allie bent to extract one wooden handle from the rubble. Could this be the good hammer, subject these last months of a near manhunt in her household? Jackknife, screwdriver. Another gust brought the children's voices, as if offering guesses. Now, Allie was in her 50s. She'd lived long enough, 18 years, in a northern rural county that she'd learned to guard her energy. Still, such screaming. She followed the cabin path to the resort's small beach, tapping the tool. She only frowned a little, noting a place at the path's edge where alternating rains and drought had nibbled. Thin strands of swaying grasses and the rash of spike rush that Allie was encouraging held everything. The one small clearing of their lawn with its swing set, horseshoe pits, bonfire circle, from ruin. Reaching Maple's cabin, Allie understood what had been nagging her in the children's cries. They weren't followed by splashes. Corkscrew, the girl called, twisting as she dropped, not into the water, glittering in the near distance with the inviting sheen of a Leinenkugel's commercial, but from the top bar of the swing set. You supervising this? Allie turned to her daughter, Cassie. The woman she was becoming flickered like a strobe light beneath the girl she'd always been, the one who could track deer, wriggle a hook from a fish belly. Allie tapped the heavy tool she still carried against her thigh. Its mysterious end terminated in short, stubby spikes, each like a teenager's lip stud. Not well, Cassie answered, shrugging. Who are these children? Allie asked.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So this novel crosses social spheres on several occasions. Allie and Bud at the beginning leave Chicago for the Northwoods of Wisconsin. And as we said, Cassie's homeschooled and in the local orchestra, but she's determined to attend public high school. And pretty much all the cabin renters live in more densely populated urban environments. So they're not necessarily from around the Northwoods. Often different skill sets are prioritized in different areas. You know, fixing a motor is not like selling stock. So how do you think about and revise characters of various backgrounds, expectations, and proficiencies?
So this is another really good question. And I think to write characters, to write any characters is difficult because you have to keep two competing things in mind. You know, one idea is that no one is a stereotype. You know, no one fits some type perfectly. You know, so even if you want to create some character that seems like they fit these three boxes, there's still going to be something about them that's mysterious, or there should be if we want them to seem like a real human. You know, they shouldn't fit perfectly into something. But then at the same time, even while no one is a stereotype, also we are all influenced by our environment. Like as we talked about before, and we're influenced by what we know and what we grew up with and what we hear. And so both things are true. You know, the situations and the social structures around us make us who we are, but we don't fit perfectly in that structure. You know, in any of those structures, there's mystery. There has to be mystery. You know, one of my professors was named Robert Boswell, and he talked a lot about writing, and when writing, keeping the space for mystery. You know, there has to be things that the writer doesn't know. There has to be some things the reader can fill in. There have to be things we still don't know, because isn't that what's true, right? You know, isn't that what's true, is that there are mysteries. We don't know everything about a person. We don't even know the full extent of ourselves. We don't even know why we do what we do or why we say what we say. I mean, so if you are trying for any degree of realism or any degree of believability, you know, saving room for this mystery is necessary. I mean, but that said, it's true. So how do I write characters who come from different backgrounds and have different expectations and skills? There's definitely challenges for me. You know, I've been a college professor for 20 years. So I live in a very specific world, you know, where my colleagues and my friends are sometimes in a bubble. Luckily, my students help me, you know, and I've taught in New Mexico, and I've taught in Oregon, and now I've come back to teach in Wisconsin, where I grew up. So I've learned from students, you know, who bring, you know, and who write, right? So I'm a writing teacher, which means I get to read all about what my students, how they see the world, what they know, what skills and things. So they help me to like understand more of the world around me. I do a little bit of research sometimes when I'm writing. Like recently I was intrigued by a news story I read about people who were doing fractal wood burning, which is something I don't know anything about and couldn't do it. And by the way, no one should do that if you're not trained as an electrician. The people I read about died doing this because it's a very dangerous hobby. But so I was reading about it and I was trying to imagine people doing it. And to some extent, I can imagine people I know who I do live in central, I live in a city, but it's within a more rural area in Wisconsin. I can imagine people who might be fascinated by woodworking and who might be skilled with a trade like this and who could do it. And so I'm half imagining and I'm half filling in with some details, that things I Google about and read. Then of course I trust readers, I would send it to some friends and the question is not, is this right? But the question is it believable? Because really that's all that matters, right? Like, do you believe that this person would know this or wouldn't know this and would be able to do this with this tool or not, and I try to find someone who would know to ask them to read it and to see what they would say. But also having said all this, I will say there are also some, I do also know that there are some stories that aren't mine to tell. There are some backgrounds, some experiences that I, as a, white lady, maybe I shouldn't try to write or I wouldn't try to publish, because at this point where we know that there are people from underrepresented backgrounds and groups who are not being published enough, it's not my story to pretend to tell that point of view or tell that perspective.
Where do you draw the line?
Right. I know that is a really good question. And I've had stories where I thought, okay, is this where do I draw the line here? I think I attended a workshop at Right on Door County that helped me to really think through some things with a group of other people about writing diversity, writing about people of diverse experiences. And one kind of thought I remember journaling by the end of that workshop, because that's the question, right? Is where do you draw the line, right? Is that to some degree, I need to see some of my identities overlapping with the identities of the characters that I'm going to publish. But I think it also depends on like how far of a reach it is, and it definitely depends on, the current context of are people marginalized, and if so, it's not. Then I believe as a writer that we can invent and write almost any experience or point of view, right? Because otherwise we'd have to hang it all up and say, well, we can't write fiction then if we're saying you can't imagine what it is to be someone else. That's the whole point. It's like being an actor. The whole point is you're inhabiting a persona, like, of course we can do it, but the question about if it's ours to publish is a second question, at least right now, Yeah.
Interesting. So let's go back to the idea of ecoterrorism. I find it fascinating, and a general definition is environmental violence carried out to further political aims. But doesn't violence, especially toward the environment, lead over time to an overall shortened lifespan, at least of the Earth? And if that is the case, it seems whatever political clout is gained comes at the cost of life in some measure. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, protection of wildlife and people also comes at a cost. There's licenses, land deeds, products, etc. So the sheer glut of information available to an average person on any topic, I find, is somewhat overwhelming. Mm-hmm. In what ways did you consider the environment, politics, information, and human interaction when composing and revising News of the Air?
This is another really good question. And let's see, I think I might, so one part in the question that I hear is like, so first of all, let me just say, I do not condone violence in any way or eco-terrorism in any way, as much as I do also believe that climate change is an urgent issue that we all need to think about and act on right now. One of the problems with writing about climate fiction is that it's a slow moving invisible villain, which is just like a craft problem, that's hard. Like, how do you write about a change in catastrophic change in temperature of 1.5 degrees? It's how do you that's a villain that doesn't have enough of face, but of course the effects of climate change are real. For the purposes of, we need something we can dramatize for fiction, we have things like floods and fires. So we have the effects of climate change, even if we can't always trace every flood or every fire to climate change, and we have things like that. But I realized that we also have the way human beings are affected by climate change, and ecoterrorism was a way to manifest the lurking villain of climate change, because that would be a human reaction to climate change that can be dramatized. The same way that, of course, the movement of people, is a real, already happening, and it's going to happen more, effect of climate change that has dramatic consequences, and that we can use in fiction, to people having to relocate, people forced to flee, or people who have to leave their homes, and the real change underlying the immediate reasons they have to leave is climate change. So that was kind of one way I was thinking about how to write about it. How do you write about this thing? You have to have something external that, so right, ecoterrorism in the prologue of my novel is the thing that prompts the two main characters to leave the city. Because, sometimes something can be slowly changing around us for a long, long time, like the frog boiling, right? But you need something to suddenly stand out to make you act, and so that was what I found that would be enough to make my two characters act. I think in your question, though, you're also asking me about a little bit about research, and like, how do we write a book that's about climate change? How do you manage how much do I research? How much do I imagine? And again, and how do I manage what's true or what's not, especially because the problem was that I wrote the book over a period of many years. It's that's a problem that fiction has as opposed to journalism. With journalism, they're like, amazing journalists, right, can do their research and write a story and it's out within a couple days, and they have all the most recent up-to-date facts. Where a fiction writer, I'm like, oh, I was writing this slowly over a period of 4 years, and the thing that I read 3 years ago, is it still true? Because now it's a central pillar of my plot, so I hope it's still true. That kind of thing. So I did. My novel is set in a kind of undefined near future of Wisconsin. I was hoping that to the reader it would seem like a mix of now or the future, and there would be times that you're like, is this now or is this 10 years from now? Because there are some things that are true and some things that are not true. And so I just decided to lean into that half true, half not true, setting, right? I wanted, a lot of things in the novel are based on something that was real or that I read. Like I tried to get the names of different invasive species correct when I have my main character notice plants and wildlife that are around the resort, but mostly because she's the kind of person who I decided would know, she would know the names of different weeds and different grasses that are growing on the shoreline. And so that's part of her point of view. It has to be correct. And I did read articles that were sort of predicting effects of the climate for northern Wisconsin and what kinds of things could be happening there. But right, it's true. You risk it all being wrong if it takes you 10 years to publish your book, which is what happened, to me. And also the other huge thing that happened, and happened to lots of folks, was that my novel is coming out this fall, September 22. And I wrote the bulk of it way before the coronavirus pandemic. And this is terrible and hilarious, but when the publisher from Black Lawrence Press called me to tell me that I had won the Big Moose Prize and that my book was going to be published, I think I even said on the phone to her, like in the midst of my emotional blabbering, I said something like, but is it still relevant? Like that's not what you should say to the publisher, right? You should just say, yes, thank you, public, please, and instead I was like, but I don't know if it's still relevant. It doesn't have anything about the pandemic in it, and maybe now it's all wrong. And I have decided that's a question for the critics, and it's no longer one I have to worry about. Although true, it's true, or it's not fortunate, it's unfortunate. But the things are intertwined too, right? Like the pandemic and climate change.
Yeah, well, I think one thing concerning that question of whether the pandemic is or is not in this book is that, we don't really stay in the cities very long, right? we're mostly out at the fishing resort, right?
Right.
So I don't think you necessarily have to have that in the novel because, an average reader is just like, oh, well, that's another reason to get out of the city, let alone, the eco-terrorism that's taking place in Chicago.
Right. Right. It's one reason certainly why people were leaving cities, just saying, man, I want to live somewhere where there's less population, right? Where I don't need to use public transport as much, right. It's true.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. As Jill said, her book is out September 22, News of the Air. Please check it out. And thank you again, Jill.
Matthew, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just elated also about your project here with 1 Week Critique. And I can't wait to share all the resources on your website with my students and with colleagues who are also teachers of writing and writers themselves. It's a really unique and cool project.
Well, thank you. We hope it is too, and we hope it's useful. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.